preach. Human beings in a mob. What's a mob to a king? What's a king to a god? What's a god to a non-believer who don't believe in anything? Will he make it out alive? Alright. No church in a while.
Hi everybody, I'm delighted to echo Damien's welcome to the second lecture of our SMI summer series given by Griffith Rollefson, who's Professor of Music at University College Cork, NUI. Griff received his PhD in musicology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has served on the faculties of music at the University of Cambridge and at the University of California, Berkeley. Griff is a widely published author. You'll find his articles in such journals as Black Music Research Journal, Popular Music and Society, also the Journal of World Popular Music. He's a generous contributor to other people's projects for which he's written numerous book chapters, for example, in the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Studies. He's perhaps best known as the author of Flip the Script, European Hip Hop and the Politics of Post-Coloniality, and that was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017. It's a really ambitious, innovative, and exciting and critical survey of European hip hop and has become a really seminal study in the field. Tonight's lecture will introduce us to some of the key ideas in his forthcoming monograph, Critical Excess, Watch the Throne and the New Gilded Age, and that's being published by the University of Michigan Press next year. And in this book, Griff grapples with very complex and topical issues as white privilege and systemic racism. Rollefson's research has been recognised by numerous learned societies and funding bodies, including the British Academy and most recently the European Commission. We're so proud of him in his role as principal investigator of the 5-year community engaged ERC research project, Cipher Hip Hop Interpolation, which is currently mapping hip hop knowledge flows on 6 continents. He's also founding co-editor of the journal Global Hip Hop Studies. Griff sees himself first and foremost as a scholar of African American musics and a cultural musicologist. And tonight's talk will relate ideas in his book to Jacques Attali's work on music's prophetic social function. In particular, he's going to discuss Z and Kanye West's 2011 concept album, Watch the Throne, as a prophetic force. His abstract raises really interesting questions about music's ability not only to reflect but to shape society. So the title of this lecture is Watch the Throne and the Last Gilded Age, Critical Excess from Jacques Attali's Noise to Tricia Rowe's Black Noise. Griff, on behalf of everyone gathered, thank you so much for sharing your research and for drawing us together this evening. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And it's been a pleasant thing to look forward to in these strange times. And thanks to Damien, Brian, and Hannah for planning and technical assistance. I get a little bit nervous about these things, even though we're doing these a lot more. But they've made it very smooth and eliminated the anxiety, or 98% of it. And finally, thank you all for being here. Like I say, I'm not entirely used to doing this kind of thing, but I'm excited to do it and hope that I can contribute to some of the debate. This is a strange subject for this time and for the worldwide movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the systemic, or the sort of pushback against systemic racism that feels different this time. And so hopefully this can be part of that conversation, and I'll look forward to the conversation afterwards. It's been an uncanny journey writing this book, first prompted by the shock of waking up to Donald Trump as president of the United States, then to a personal need to make some kind of sense of this new reality, this surreality, and finally to planting and nurturing the seed of a strange little idea linking Attali to this luxury rap album, and realizing the connection then to what is probably the foundational text in hip hop studies, Tricia Rose's Black Noise. So I'll call this talk Watch the Throne and the Last Gilded Age, Critical Excess from Jacques Attali's Noise to Tricia Rose's Black Noise. It introduces the forthcoming book, Critical Excess, Watch the Throne and the Last Gilded Age, which is forthcoming from University of Michigan Press's Tracking Pop series next spring. The second half of the talk then focuses in on one track from the album to give us a sense of what critical excess looks and sounds like. I hope the talk can offer a timely and incisive look at the cultural contours of white privilege and systemic racism for our Black Lives Matter era. It argues that this album is a prophetic force, detailing how Z and Kanye West stoked white resentment and helped create the conditions for a Trump presidency. Conditions that presage our present, final stage of capitalist decay. Indeed, this book argues that Watch the Throne is capitalism's death dance. Watch the Throne is a self-avowed luxury rap album centered on Eurocentric constructions of nobility, artistry, and race. Notably, it's also an album that is about the excess associated with royalty. It is an album obsessed with Europe, with nobility, with artistry, and with whiteness. In 1920, W.B. Du Bois wrote of this very network of white privilege in The Souls of White Folk, chapter 2 of his Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. He writes, "Here it is that the comedy verges to tragedy. The first minor note is struck, all unconsciously, by those worthy souls in whom consciousness of high descent brings burning desire to spread the gift abroad, the obligation of nobility to the ignoble. Such sense of duty assumes two things, a real possession of the heritage and its frank appreciation by the humble born. So long then as humble black folk, voluble with thanks, receive barrels of old clothes from lordly and generous whites, there's much mental peace and moral satisfaction. But when the black man begins to dispute the white man's title to certain alleged bequests of the fathers in wage and position, authority and training, and when his attitude towards charity is sullen anger rather than humble jollity, when he insists on his human right to swagger and swear and waste, then the spell is suddenly broken." In this book, I show how Z and Kanye seem to accede to the Eurocentric signifiers of couture, but through their luxury rap strategy of black conspicuous consumption that I dub critical excess, performatively exceed the logics of Europe, nobility, and artistry, and break the spell of white supremacy. Articulating the Black Atlantic, post-colonial, and critical theory of Du Bois, Tricia Rose, Cedric Robinson, Fred Moten, and Houston Baker, to Jacques Attali's theorizations about the prophetic nature of music, I argue that the album brings the idea of Europe to its logical conclusion and heralds the final stage of late capitalism, our current 1%er era, the new Gilded Age. Further, through their performative blackness and conspicuous consumption, their critical excess on the luxury rap album, I show how Z and Kanye fashion a move directly from the subhuman to the superhuman. Indeed, this move draws simultaneously on post-colonial technologies of strategic essentialism and critical excess, moving effortlessly from the jungle and the ghetto to the penthouse and the throne. Here's where Attali's political economy and proto-sound studies proves especially illuminating. Attali writes, "The musician, like music, is ambiguous. He plays a double game. He is simultaneously musicus and cantor, reproducer and prophet. If an outcast, he sees society in a political light. If accepted, he is its historian, the reflection of its deepest values. He speaks of society and he speaks against it. This duality was already present before capital arrived to impose its own rules and prohibitions. The distinction between musician and non-musician, which separates the group from the speech of the sorcerer, undoubtedly represents one of the very first divisions of labor, one of the first social differentiations in the history of humanity, even predating the social hierarchy. Shaman, doctor, musician. He is one of society's first gazes upon itself. He is one of the first catalyzers of violence and myth. I will show later that the musician is an integral part of the sacrifice process, a channeler of violence, and that the primal identity, magic, music, sacrifice, rite, expresses the musician's position in the majority of civilizations, simultaneously excluded relegated to a place near the bottom of the social hierarchy, and superhuman, the genius, the adored and deified star, simultaneously a separator and an integrator. In the book, I argue that this sounds in many ways apropos of this album's cultural critique and our current situation. For our purposes here, in their performance of critical access on Watch the Throne, I argue that the two move between the excluded subhuman and the adored superhuman, thus eschewing the normative category of human, and in so doing, rendering that category a played-out remnant of individualized bourgeois capitalism. That is, in exercising their human right to swagger and swear, but doing so as unapologetically rich Black men, Z and Kanye undermine the racially coded language of humanity, break the spell of white supremacy, and bring the Enlightenment colonial idea of Europe to an end. And just to underscore what I mean by humanity here, when you hear that term in this talk, I encourage you to think, all lives matter. Indeed, in recent years, it's become increasingly clear that humanism and its universalist ideology is, as Etienne Balibar has argued, a trick. As I show through close musical, textual, and visual analysis, Watch the Throne performs for us the reality that white supremacy is capitalism. Indeed, recent global events have clearly indicated the limits of capitalism's supposedly colorblind ideology. One last point about Attali before I move on. I'd never put it together that the Bruegel detail on the cover of Noise was meant as a play on the cultural figure of the pre-capitalist jongleur that Attali theorizes as both musical prophet and historian in the text. In her afterword to the 1985 English translation, Susan McClary suggests that the then lively New Wave movement might rise to serve a similar function with its compositional, grassroots DIY critique. We'll have to forgive her for her non-prophecy there, because she does go on to write insightfully about the transformative social function of hip-hop later in the decade. But for anyone in hip-hop studies today, the mention of prophet and historian, shaman, doctor, musician, will instantly call up the image of the West African griot, to whom countless hip-hop MCs look as forebear. The jongleur, we might say, is the European inheritance of a global history of bards and oral historian prophets, from ancient Ireland and pre-Homeric Greece to Senegal, China, and Native America. Indeed, Attali's 1977 Noise is itself, to borrow a phrase, prophetic of hip-hop's grassroots DIY culture that Tricia Rose would come to theorize as Black noise. And Imani Perry would elaborate in her book, Prophets of the Hood. This is the critical trajectory that I pick up in this book. Similarly, the book's also intended as a follow-up and complement to my monograph, Flip the Script, European Hip-Hop and the Politics of Post-Coloniality. In that study, I examine how the children and grandchildren of immigrants from the former colonies and peripheries of Europe employ the iconic African-American model of music protest, while simultaneously infiltrating and instrumentalizing the global cultural industry to various ends. A central claim of that book is that by studying European hip-hop, we can hear US hip-hop anew. This new book about Watch the Throne's cultural critique furthers that claim, offering a musically savvy and geopolitically attuned look at one hip-hop artifact that places the cultural inheritance of Eurocentrism in the US at the center of its critique, touching on everything from the Socratic method, Christian hegemony, and feudalism, to colonization, slave capitalism, social Darwinism, Parisian haute couture, and museumized art. Indeed, in the book, I show how European patrimony not only casts a long shadow on the album's lyric, music, image, and performativities, but how its impossible inheritance is absolutely fundamental to Watch the Throne's conceptualization and realization, and Z and Kanye's critique thereof. While African-American artists and scholars have musically negotiated the idea of Europe since even before W.E.B. Du Bois first committed his thoughts on the Afro-European mingling audible in the Sorrow songs, this book shows how this musical artifact from the recent past marks a turning point, undermining the very logic of Europe by laying bare and then exceeding its commitments to race, to whiteness. To be sure, Josephine Baker, Sidney Bechet, Paul Robeson, Dexter Gordon, James Baldwin, Nina Simone, Don Cherry, and countless other Black American expats would be drawn to the idea of Europe after they've seen Paris. Many reconciled themselves to the idea of Europe and its cultural patrimoine, and many also provoked, undermined, and altered that Eurocentric hegemony. Ironically, what these African Americans all had in common was that they helped create the lion's share of cultural wealth over the course of their century, but pocketed a mere fraction of that wealth. In this book, I argue that on Watch the Throne, Z and Kanye West, with their collaborators from Beyonce, Frank Ocean, and Mr. Hudson, stand on the shoulders of 20th century Black American artists and lift off from the idea of Europe by exceeding the excellence, opulence, and decadence of the white royalty that resides at the heart of the idea of Europe, the nobility and high descent of Du Bois's lordly and generous whites. Notably, in escaping the thrall of this most elevated form of white supremacy, nobility, J and Ye also flattened Langston Hughes's infamous racial mountain. As Jay-Z puts it on the secret final track, Illest Motherfucker Alive, "When I say it, then you see it. It ain't only in the music. Basquiat's Warhols serving as my muses. My house like a museum, so I see him when I'm peeing. Usually you have this much taste, you European. That's the end of that way of thinking. Nigga, never again." Just as he seems to accede to the museumized logic of Western ideologies of high art, Jay exceeds the logic thereof by placing these icons in his toilet. In just a few lines of verse and a few bars of urgent sonic swagger, he undermines the ideology of art, nobility by birth, and Europe's sine qua non, whiteness. With poignant irony, however, he does so both artfully and passionately, as he does with countless other conceptual and performative gems throughout the album. Similarly, on Otis, Kanye West undermines the race and class logics of the racial mountain with his line, "Luxury rap, the Hermes of verses, sophisticated ignorance, write my curses in cursive," literally flipping the script from a signifier of visual elegance to sonic vulgarité. On Niggas in Paris, Kanye lays bare and further elaborates the ways that class and language work to uphold the fallacy of race and its entanglement with the received ideas about Europe and as nobility, spitting the infamous lines, "Bougie girl, grab my hand, fuck that bitch, she don't want to dance. Excuse my French, but I'm in France. I'm just saying. Prince Williams ain't do it right if you ask me. 'Cause I was him, I would have married Kate and Ashley." In the first two couplets here, Ye plays on the idiom, "excuse my French," directing the listener towards the ear-catching misogynistic red flag, while slyly playing on the only French word in the lyric, bougie, a subversive bit of wordplay for his listeners patient enough to abide the sexism. Similarly, he seems to drag the esteemed British Prince William down to the gutter level of pop culture with his proposal for a polygamous arrangement with TV's Olsen twins. Yet in so doing, he also reminds the listener that both the royal and the B-list celebs exist in their truest form in the tabloid press, a fact that today is manifestly obvious in Brexit-era England. These are just a few examples of an album that systematically defaces and destabilizes the received idea of Europe, an idea that today has considerably changed since the Fisk Jubilee Singers first performed before Queen Victoria, and since jazz's royalty of dukes and counts first took on the mantle as the world's most influential artists nearly 100 years ago. Indeed, in addition to the lyrical rhetorics and visual performances on Watch the Throne, this book also focuses on the swing, swag, and other sonic performative legacies of Black American music evident throughout the album. As just one noteworthy example, in this second half of this talk, I'll perform a musical and political economy analysis of Otis, centered on the track's resignification of Otis Redding's classic soul tune, Try a Little Tenderness, a song about the role of materialism in a love economy and the value of love in a materialistic society. Indeed, on the track Otis, the priceless soul tune and the costly sample thereof is itself treated like a gem that is cut, refashioned, and polished, just as a pricey Maybach German automobile is cut, refashioned, and polished in the recombinatory narrative of the track's video. That both are commodities seem all too clear to J and Ye. That much has changed in the 50 years since the release of Redding's Tenderness too seems clear. Nonetheless, on the J&Ye track, the vocal power and pure affect of the wordless climax to Redding's 1966 classic is beautifully recomposed, acceding to the aristocratic ideology of the European artistic tradition, but exceeding that regal ethos to emerge in the domain of Du Bois's swagger and Jay's boastful swag. In sum, in this book, I look to the realm of music to explain nothing less than the unprecedented inequality of our new Gilded Age and its ongoing geopolitical realignment from Trumpism to Brexit and the destabilization of the EU, as evidenced by Euro-American politics being reduced to the unsustainable poles of neoliberal globalization versus ethno-national protectionism. In the wake of Brexit and Trumpism, it seems we need to take seriously the prophetic force of hip-hop, even, or maybe especially, luxury rap. For J&Ye's performative and critical excess seems to exceed the limits of conspicuous consumption and usher in an age of deeply ambivalent hypercapitalism, a late stage that finally looks primed to eat itself. Thus, I argue that the critical excess performed on Watch the Throne is a consumption so conspicuous that it amounts to a critique of capitalism, that J&Ye's unashamed Black excellence, opulence, and decadence amount to a full circle anti-essentialist critique of whiteness as capitalism, a doubled critique exemplified in Kanye's construction. I adopted these niggas. I Philip Drummond them. This is critical excess. Indeed, the gilded album art for Watch the Throne would fit comfortably in 45's Trump Tower penthouse, as might Kanye himself, as we've seen. As recent political events have made abundantly clear, long-promised freedoms for some have been perceived as existential threats for others. This was true in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, as Reconstruction fanned the flames of racial violence. It was true during and after the fight for Civil Rights Act in 1964, as Jim Crow fell, kicking and screaming, burning and lynching. And it's been increasingly true since the election of the nation's first Black president, as the edifice of white privilege succumbed to the greatest structural impropriety: Barack Hussein Obama and his African-American family living in the White House, a Black man sitting on the throne. As we've already seen in the ironies of recent geopolitical realignments, once Black and brown people begin breaking the glass ceiling, capitalism's racialized underpinnings will begin to erode because, to borrow a phrase from Ta-Nehisi Coates, the people who think themselves white will cease their buy-in to the capitalist hegemony and its globalist free market ideology. Was J&Ye's luxury rap swag instrumental in these political developments? I think so. Was Barack Obama's presidency instrumental in the mobilization and politicization of Tea Party and Trumpist anti-Black racism? Absolutely. Indeed, between the gilded excess of Watch the Throne's album art here on the left and Kendrick Lamar's Thuggish Nightmare here on the right, we have a powerful rhetorical encapsulation of the bifurcation of subhuman and superhuman that echoed throughout the Obama presidency. As I say, in the second part of this talk, I'll make a case study of the fourth track, Otis, that I mentioned, to elaborate and detail my argument. But first, there's the problem of Kanye, to which I must attend, if only briefly and provisionally. Kanye finding his dragon energy soulmate in Donald Trump is as scary and disconcerting to me as anyone. How he went from speaking truth to power on live television in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to being in thrall to alt-right power in Trump's White House, I can't say. That said, Kanye's non-compliance with racial orthodoxies in US party politics does seem to augur what I'm suggesting here, that we're at a time of great social upheaval and political realignment. Whether for good or ill, I won't pretend to know. We got some preliminary answers in the 2018 midterm elections in the US, when non-disenfranchised Americans went to the polls. But in the wake of the Mueller report and dismantling of the Department of Justice, we have learned that American nation of laws is instead remarkably reliant on political norms and legal memos. As such, the US seems to be sliding into a fascist dystopia, new things emerging every day. But as a respected colleague of mine recently suggested, Because of this global upheaval, socialism is back on the table. Indeed, it is. Again, I won't pretend to know how to read the tea leaves. I am not myself a prophet. So how do you solve a problem like Kanye? You don't. You just listen. I'm not terribly interested in Kanye's personal reality TV reality, but suffice it to say that the evidence of his potential turn is scattered throughout the 2011 album. For instance, when he raps about making his son be Republican, so everybody know he loved white people. And notably, those couplets about transgressing US racial political orthodoxies are delivered over a Nina Simone sample, lines from her signature tune, Feelin' Good, in which Nina sounds more hell-bent on revenge than good. Of course, Nina struggled with her own mental health throughout her career in, as Fanon would put it, a racially sick society. Though I won't go further into this line of inquiry today, the subject of Black madness as strategy and social construction is in fact an important point of reference in the book, and I deal with that at length. Okay, so the balance of this talk is drawn from the book's final chapter, Sophisticated Ignorance, the Deformation of Mastery. Otis begins with the rich, Leslie diffused tone of Booker T. Jones' Hammond M3 organ, supported by a slow and steady rimshot pulse. After almost a full bar of the sustained organ chord, Otis Redding's soulful baritone finally enters with the line, "It makes it easier." Recognizing the rhetorical direction of Redding's call, a piano responds, lightening the tone color and leading upward a step to a pivot chord that's doubled by Booker T's organ. Redding responds in turn, elaborating, "Easier to bear." As the piano and organ continue their upward motion, a guitar plays a sweet-picked and lilting line back down to the release of the tonic, a return to easy, stable ground. Redding confirms the arrival. Yeah. Here's the opening.
It makes it easier to bear.
From the harmonic rhetoric of the instrumental arrangement to the text sense of mid-sentence conclusion, it becomes immediately apparent that Otis starts in medias res. Kanye West's production on the track famously dwells on this pivotal sample from the second minute of Redding's Try a Little Tenderness, slowing down the original and dropping Booker T and the MG's accompaniment down a fourth to linger in its sonic nuance and romantic, soulful mastery. Indeed, throughout the track, the sample is held up for us to regard like a precious gem. Ye holds up tenderness like Jay's proverbial diamond gesture and lets it spin, allowing his audience ample time to behold the pricey commodity, the costly sample. Tom Brian begins his July 21st, 2011 Pitchfork review of Otis with the following critique cum compliment centered on the costly sample. Here's Jay-Z on the Otis intro. It sounds so soulful, don't you agree? Well, yeah, if you're willing to plunk down enough money to sample Try a Little Tenderness, that'll happen. But even if the sample works as a sort of audio money flaunt, it's also a tough and hard chop from Kanye. Otis Redding's magnificent voice, mostly limited to a couple of hellfire grunts, the song itself held to a sharp guitar stab. More than simply providing the raw materials for a hip-hop beat, the Redding sample is a costly token of mastery, regarded with reverence, so much so that this, the fourth cut of Watch the Throne, would take on the first name of the sample's headline artist, Otis. Here Kanye's production has his audience in thrall to his ostentatious display of wealth, to the classic sample, and as we'll see, to his masterfully artistic deformation thereof. We are now watching the throne. From a musical perspective, Redding's vocals over the course of the original source track are striking for the way that they paint a picture of tenderness that nonetheless grows increasingly aggressive, full-throated, and rough, climaxing in the unbridled affect of Redding's gravel-toned yet soulful grunts and exhortations. The entirety of the 1966 Redding track is, in fact, constructed as something of a crescendo. It begins with the pastoral innocence of a tender muted trumpet and tenor sax introduction in gently intertwining counterpoint, before slowly building an aesthetic energy and developing the conceptual argument over the course of the song. By track's end, Redding leads a loud and rhythmically driving jam that is more raw than tender. As such, it'll be useful to listen to J and Ye's Otis with Redding's Try a Little Tenderness firmly established in our ears. Indeed, on Otis, J and Ye are re-signifying the mastery of form exhibited on this classic soul track. Far from disrespecting it, they're showing how their music is indebted to Otis, Booker T, and their milieu of Black musicians, that of the soul and civil rights generation. Yet, as we'll see, their 21st century music must by necessity speak to their contemporary world, both socially and sonically. In this, the book's final chapter, I argue that J and Ye's resignification of Otis is a form of sonic and social subversion that Houston Baker terms the deformation of mastery in his influential book, Modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. As we'll see, this deformation is not directed at Otis Redding and his music per se, but at his mid-century American capitalist habitus, its exchange economy metaphysics that equate love and things in the right proportions, and its supplementarity, the suggestion that love might suffice in lieu of material things, where things are posited as the preferred or normative romantic currency. This is the capitalist episteme that commoditized love and created Valentine's Day, champagne, red roses, and chocolate bonbon as we know them today, and as J and Ye will expound. This is the capitalist system that indeed invented romance as we understand it. Redding has mastered these white bourgeois sensibilities, mastered these economics for his community, demonstrated this mastery on sound recording, and sold them back to his society to garner himself some agency. J and Ye, having already gamed the system, have other aims in mind. As the introductory horn duet winds to a conclusion on the sample source, Try a Little Tenderness, and the trumpet lethargically moans across the threshold, the electric guitar welcomes them home with the reassurance of a sweet picked tonic chord, and Redding delivers his earnest opening lines in an unhurried rubato tempo. Oh, she may be weary. Them young girls, they do get wearied, wearing that same old shaggy dress. But when she gets weary, try a little tenderness. Throughout the first verse, Redding's heartfelt vocal lines elaborate the economics of love in a capitalist society. By centering the old shaggy dress, Redding performs for his audience an accounting of the emotional value of material goods vis-a-vis romantic affection, especially given the inability of working men of limited means to provide nice things for the subjects of their affection. His earnestly considered advice is supported by low, sustained organ tones, like a Baptist preacher at the beginning of an invitation. From time to time, the congregation, the organ, piano, and tenor sax, respond to his calls with short riffs and soulful affirmations. On the second verse, Booker T and the MGs heighten the dramatic energy, establishing a groove around rim shots on every beat. Redding continues, still supported by tasty and unobtrusive organ, piano, and guitar lines. You know she's waiting, just anticipating, for things that she'll never, 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 never possess. But while she's there waiting without them, try a little tenderness. Here, the music aesthetic translate the yearning for things into sonic anticipation, as Redding not only explains but performs his theory about the value of love in a materialistic society and the role of materialism in a love economy. In a capitalist society of winners and losers, makers and takers, he suggests love compensates for those things she'll never possess, as the tick-tock of the rim shots and the searching chords heighten our anticipation.
Oh, she may be weary. Them young girls, they do get wearied wearing that same old shaggy dress. Yeah, yeah. But when she gets weary, try a little tenderness. Yeah, yeah. Oh, man, You know she's waiting, just anticipating for things that she'll never, 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 never possess, yeah. But while she's there waiting, and without them, try a little tenderness. That's all you gotta do.
Although Redding's Stax-era soul and R&B version of Try a Little Tenderness is very different in musical style, indeed in melody and harmony as well, it's worth pausing here to note that this song about love and things was written in 1933 by the British songwriting team of Jimmy Campbell, Reg Connolly, and Harry M. Woods at the height of the Great Depression. It became a global hit through recordings by Ray Noble and Bing Crosby during a time of calamitous economic turmoil and widespread poverty across Europe and the US. While Noble's 1933 Foxtrot version is nearly identical to the 1966 version, Otis Redding's, Bing's version includes an entire rubato introduction highlighting the hustle and bustle of modern life in 1934. The lyric begins evincing a tragically quaint nostalgia for simpler times. Let's listen.
In the hustle of today, we're all inclined to miss those little things that mean so much. A word, a smile, a kiss. When a woman loves a man, he's a hero in her eyes. And a hero he can always be if he'll just realize. She may be weary, women do get weary, wearing the same shabby dress. And when she's weary, try a little tenderness.
Here, the crooner lingers on the last syllable of the intro, giving it the signature Bing treatment on realize. After violin rises in chromatic resolution to end the intro, Bing begins the song in earnest. The added text makes explicit those other loving actions that can stand in for romantic commodities, those little things that mean so much, that can cement the man's status as a hero in her eyes, if he'll just realize that there's a tried and true plan for human intimacy in the age of global dehumanizing poverty. Just try a little tenderness. If we track the tune from its 1933 genesis through its 1966 reinterpretation to its 2011 sampling on Otis, it becomes clear that the song must have had very similar purchase among its Great Depression, Civil Rights era, and Great Recession audiences. To be sure, this savvy bit of advice must have seemed something of a game changer for those men struggling to endure the demoralizing effects of these economic and cultural upheavals. Most likely the words of Bing, Otis, J and Ye eased the burden of poverty in a land of plenty. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just came off as tired platitudes. Or, coming from the mouths of these entitled Black millionaires in particular, maybe they enraged mainstream white Americans. Maybe this sample, in the context of this track and its luxury rap album, just reminded them of the unfulfilled promises of the American dream. Maybe it struck them as proof of the slow dismantling of the assurances afforded by the white privilege that underwrites the nation's public life. Indeed, maybe these Black millionaires just confirmed Arlie Russell Hochschild's conclusions in Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, that Black success is hateful to conservative whites, that every Black success is viewed as cutting in line. J and Ye's use of the song for their luxury rap album was much denigrated in its context of the global economic downturn, the Great Recession, and not just by Donald John Trump's silent electoral minority. As just one notable example, in his first September 2011 review for Rolling Stone, Jody Rosen opined, "Such moments are too scarce on Watch the Throne. More often we hear about big rocks and gold bottles, which, by the way, rhymes with scold models. In the midst of an early 20th century Great Recession, the vicarious experience of opulence may be enough for Jay and Kanye's millions of fans, but on a record this ambitious, this sonically bold, it's a shame two of music's greatest storytellers don't extend their gaze beyond their own luxe lives. Just like Brian's Pitchfork review, Rosen's piece here offers a modicum of begrudging respect and admiration, but reflects the widely held critical opinion that the album was above all a chance for these two halves to have even more. A chance for talented millionaires to synergize and maximize their respective investments. As I've argued, this widely publicized view is this fundamental misreading of an album that is, in fact, replete with deeply subversive forms of conspicuous consumption on a stunningly wide array of levels. As we'll see, the recombination and resignification of this costly sample is yet another form of critical excess, a deformation of mastery, with an explicitly political message that amounts to much more than a chance to gaze at their own luxe lives. It's not in spite of the Great Recession that they perform this over-the-top accounting of Black excellence, but because of this historic failure of global capitalism. Even more importantly for our purposes here, however, is the fact that as I perform this cultural analysis of the 2011 album in 2020, global geopolitics are dangerously reminiscent of the mid-1930s in both political and cultural respects. Analyses of Trump's fascist and right-wing populist leanings are widely available, as are discussions of Brexit's dismantling of the post-war peace and broader right-wing trends across Europe. As I describe in the book, on Watch the Throne, Jay and Ye deformed tenderness and its politics to bypass the discourse of humanity that was so central to civil rights politics and the rule of law, to bypass the cultural logic that allowed Redding to appropriate and update, but not change, Bing Crosby's universalizing masculinist message, to bypass the discourse of Black respectability that laid the groundwork for everything from Motown becoming the voice of young America to the election of the nation's first Black president. As we know now, the Black respectability politics so famously framed in the album art for Kendrick Lamar's cover art for To Pimp a Butterfly, cover art that pits those stereotyped Black thugs of America's nightmare against the reality of its intelligent, decent, and humane Black president, Barack Obama. These are dead as Bill Cosby's Black respectability politics are. The November 8th, 2017 election of Donald Trump as President of the United States of America issued a firm rejoinder to Black respectability politics, just as it closed the door on the foregone conclusion that the nation would elect its first woman to the highest office in the land. In the third verse of the Otis Redding sample source, Tenderness, the bass walks down a fifth to establish a new tonal center on C major, further heightening the waiting and anticipating that Redding is singing about, and giving the listener the sense that the stakes have just been raised. We're about to go somewhere.
It's not just sentimental, no, no, no. She had her grief and care, yeah, yeah, yeah. But the soft words, they all spoke so gentle, yeah. It makes it easier to bear, yeah.
Here, Redding's delivery grows more urgent, the timbre of his voice more rough-hewn. Indeed, on the word soft in the above couplet, Redding growls, his throat now contradicting the gentle anticipation and performative soft words about which he's advising us. As we'll see, this lyrically, musically, and performatively contradictory background on Try a Little Tenderness provides the springboard for Kanye's recomposition on Otis, and notably, his refiguration of Redding's mid-century African-American economics. It's at this very moment in the original, It Makes It Easier, that Kanye starts his sample for Otis. Here, between the first and second half of the last couplet, Ye rightly recognizes that we have reached the first major structural arrival in Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness, the surprise entrance of the rich and forceful organ chord. Indeed, this is the striking Hammond M3 organ chord that I described earlier, the Booker T attack that starts the J and Ye track. Most importantly, it's this organ entrance that highlights the takeaway, the punchline of Redding's words of wisdom on the track. Whether in the Great Depression, the Civil Rights era, the Great Recession, or the shifting sands of today's uncanny and socially distanced pandemic era, the takeaway is that a bit of loving tenderness makes poverty, economic uncertainty, and quotidian struggle easier to bear. Here we can finally consider the two tracks together. After the sweet-picking guitar line brings us back down to the easy stability of the tonic chord, Otis starts in earnest. As the horns lay down a soothing accompaniment of sustained chords to a cha-cha-cha piano accompaniment, Redding begins on the J and Ye track, "You won't regret it. Some girls, they don't forget it. Love is their only happiness." After a couple organ stab interjections, an otherwise unremarkable descending 5-note piano line marks a chord change in the original. In Kanye's reconfiguration, however, this simple stepwise gesture becomes a structural centerpiece. Here, Ye stops the source track and suspends the flow of time, incessantly looping the downward piano gesture while building in volume and skipping forward to a stuttering and glitchy reiteration of the word squeeze from later line, "Squeeze her, don't tease her, never leave her." When Ye lets the full line spin, the harmony rises stepwise, building tension, yearning, and anticipation, and inverting the descending piano loop that leads up to Jay's first entrance. The first verse of the track thus begins, "I invented swag." In the background, Ye's beat settles into a driving yet harmonically static, urgent yet non-lexical loop of Redding's got to, na, na, na from the track's climax. And like Ye's recombination of Otis and Booker's demonstrated mastery on tenderness, in changing the common usage noun swagger into the non-normative swag, Jay situates himself in his own genre frame and within the history of Black music more broadly. Jay simultaneously draws on the trendiness of the word swag in the early 2000s, argues that his transmutation predates these usages, and claims that not only did he invent the word, but he invented its next level swagger, its swagger. Let's watch and listen to this opening of the track. Now with all that in mind.
It makes it easier to bear. You won't regret it, no. Some girls, they don't forget it. Love is their own happiness. Sweet, sweet.
Sounds so soulful, don't you agree? I invented sweat, popping bottles, putting supermodels in a cab. Proof. I guess I got my swagger back.
While Attali might take the repetitive looping of Otis's hellfire grunts as typical of capitalist production, I hear it as emblematic of a deformational hyper-repetition, a sonic flaunt, if you will, an artistic form of critical excess. In skipping the tenderness title lines, Ye also skips the sonic buildup and increasingly sexist subtext that accompanies the text. In their stead, Jay breaks the fourth wall, entering the sonic frame and asking us, the audience, "Sounds so soulful, don't you agree?" Jay is talking about Otis's soulfulness, of course, but he's also commenting on Ye's signifying hypersoul on the track. For in sampling, deconstructing, and recombining tenderness, Jay has taken the mastery of Otis Redding, Booker T, and his MGs and catapulted them to the next level. Just as he deformed this cut, polished, and precious diamond, just like the video's cutting of that luxury car, Kanye is here cutting and recomposing this soul classic, tenderness. This, I argue, is the deformation of mastery, an attitude and methodology that, according to Baker's theory, refutes a master's nonsense. It returns, often transmuting standard syllables to the tribe. This nonsense is not the content of Redding's situated advice, but the form of the commodity that is supplementary to romantic affect and mimics human intimacy, the popular musical recording. Indeed, we might say that also that this deformational critique extends to the notated musical form of the published popular song as well. For not only is there a wealth of syllabic transformation in Kanye's deformation, but a refutation of the searching harmonic rhetoric of the 1933 song, a return to the tribe of hip-hop's harmonic stasis and rhythmic complexity. As I argue in the book, this deformation works not just musically, but conceptually across both form and content, sound and ideology. In light of the theoretical model of Afro-American modernism that Baker lays out in Modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, and this book's analysis of full circle yet next level mastery, it'll be worth returning to the Du Bois excerpt that I started with. In 1920, we might say Du Bois explained hip-hop's cultural inheritance of thug life, social critique, thus. So long then, as humble black folk, voluble with thanks, receive barrels of old clothes from lordly and generous whites, there is much mental peace and moral satisfaction. But when the black man begins to dispute the white man's title to certain alleged bequests of the fathers in wage and position, authority and training, and when his attitude towards charity is sullen anger rather than humble jollity, when he insists on his human right to swagger and swear and waste, then the spell is suddenly broken. 100 years after the publication of Du Bois's Dark Water, J and Ye have insisted. They have tasted success. They have attained the position, authority, and training of the lordly and generous whites. They have sipped from the chalice of nobility. Furthermore, they have seen a black man take the throne. They've seen a racist man usurp that throne. And now, because of these wild vacillations, it seems at long last that the throne might fall, that the spell of white supremacy and its sine qua non, capitalism, might be broken. Indeed, I urge all of you listening here to continue working to fulfill the prophecy of black noise, such as this. Thank you.
Sounds so soulful, don't you agree?